Welcome to the London Free Press Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Gilbert. London woke up to a new mayor-elect and a slew of new councillors after last night's municipal election. There were a lot of landslide victories, a few upsets, and some very close calls. Despite some changes, though, it seems Londoners were pretty apathetic about the whole thing, as voter turnout was incredibly, if not historically low, at about 25%. The new council takes the helm on November 15th with a new mayor and 8 new councillors out of 14. So today I'm talking with London Free Press City Hall reporter Megan Stacey about the election results and what's to come with London's brand new council. Hi, Megan. How are you?
I am doing well. How are you, Rachel?
I'm good. Have you had enough coffee to keep you awake after your late nights last
What
night?
a night. I
Yeah, that was
actually
late.
claim responsibility because I told my newsroom results would be in pretty early. So, I'm never going to do that again. I'll tell you what.
It's like you jinxed it. You
I
jinxed it. And
did.
then it's,
I
oh,
did.
darn it. We're out till 2 a.m, right? Yeah. Yeah. So let's first talk about voter turnout because that's a huge thing. Really, did anybody actually vote in this election?
Bottom line, no. Yeah,
Yeah.
you had about 1 in 4 eligible voters in London, cast a ballot, like, just over 25%, which is, we'll have to do a little bit of investigating, but that's certainly the lowest in any recent history, and I think might be the lowest ever. Just so poor and really so disappointing, to see so few people turn out, and,
Hmm.
we talked before about how important local government is, it affects your life, but the reality is it was, a pretty quiet race. People are burnt out for a number of reasons. Lots of theories about why that is, but yeah, the bottom line is that people just did not vote. They did not care, or at least didn't care enough to drag themselves out and spend, 10 minutes marking their ballot.
Marking a ballot or investigating who these candidates were, right? Because that could be a job in itself. They say that if you don't vote, you can't complain, right? So we're not going to have very many complainers over the next 4 years here in
Smooth
London, it
sailing, I
seems.
think, right?
Smooth
Yeah, it'll be
sailing.
great.
Nobody's going to be complaining at all. Did you talk to any experts, or maybe that's something that's to come about, some of those theories about why voter turnout was so low? Why don't we care right now?
I know, it's really disappointing, and I think for people who do care, that is just such a punch to the gut to see such a low turnout, and I think, it does actually speak to the wider race, like, what we saw unfold last night. So you asked if I was speaking to any experts. Yes. In fact, I had to trash my whole story that was, I was kind of pre-writing, little behind the scenes of the journalism biz. Of course, we have to start writing things early,
Yep.
and, the overall picture, that big picture, I literally trashed my whole story. Well,
Oh
virtually
boy.
trashed my story, right? So I was calling up new experts at 11:30 at night because the bottom line is you've got more than half of city council is brand new right now. And
Yeah.
so Martin Horak, political scientist at Western University, said something that I thought was really interesting. When you have such low voter turnout, like 1 in 4 voters, right? A quarter of people who could
Mhm.
vote actually did it. What you've got there, he says, is a bit of a different picture. You've got a very engaged core group. So it's not, what the number of people we want to see headed out to the polls, but those who are there, folks who, maybe follow politics really closely or cared enough to do their research, as you mentioned. And so he says, that really affects the race in other ways, different races, because some of those usual markers, usual deterrents, things like name recognition might not matter as much. If you've got
Yeah.
a really interested, engaged person, they're going to be doing their research. Maybe they don't care. They're not just marking the ballot because they recognize the name. So I
Sure.
thought that was a really interesting point because we saw 3 upsets last night, in addition to the 5 races where we knew we would see new faces joining council because incumbents weren't seeking reelection.
Sure.
And you got to wonder if that played a role, in some of those defeats. And the other thing that Martin mentioned to me, an interesting trend, or I'm not sure if you could call it a trend with 2 people, but both the appointed councillors, so Miriam Hamu in Ward 6 and John Fife Miller in Ward 13, Both were appointed about a year ago after sort of unprecedented situation with two vacancies after two counselors resigned. And so their colleagues chose them. They appointed people to fill those seats. And both of those politicians, despite, obviously huge name recognition, they've been in the job and have the title for almost a year. And I would argue, a decent job representing their constituents, no
Yeah.
major scandals. Not everyone was happy with their votes, of course, but no major problems. And
Right.
they're both turfed last night. So you got to wonder, is this a case of people saying, we didn't like that process? We want to actually elect
Sure.
our own counselors? Maybe not, but it's sure interesting to keep note of. And there were a number of people at that time who said we shouldn't be appointing. So kind of raises that question again, does council need a better process? So just a
Sure.
few oddities, right? But yeah, the bottom line is nobody voted, and people who did clearly wanted some change.
Yes, obviously, half the council is different. We have a brand new mayor. We knew that was going to happen. So let's kind of go through maybe word by word, but we'll start with the mayor. Josh Morgan is our new mayor. Khalil Ramal was kind of his closest opponent, but this was like not even a race last night.
Absolutely. Morgan, that was the first decisive victory, the first person that we knew, and probably a lot of people would have said we knew that going into Monday night as well. But, Morgan walked away with like 2/3 of the vote. So, huge margin. He was very, gracious, said he was humbled, all of the usual things that you would expect him to say, and basically trumpeting that mantra of we're ready to get back to work and continue on the good work. He's of course been on council for 2 terms. I
Hmm.
will give Ramal some credit. He had a tough campaign. Like personally, he lost his mom in the middle of the campaign. His father's also in the hospital, and he still showed up, right? So he took home about 22.5% of the vote last night. So as you say, well below, not giving Morgan much of a race at all. But he
Yeah.
also showed up to our BC Place where there was an event to speak to reporters, or at least this reporter.
Yeah.
And I give him credit for that. I really do. He wasn't there. He watched the results at his campaign office, saw a huge defeat and then showed up to respond. And he said,
Right.
listen, we did what we could. I thought it was a good fight. We raised the issues important to Londoners, homelessness, transit, all sorts of other things. And the people have decided that's that. So
Very gracious in defeat.
absolutely, I thought so
Yeah.
anyways, and, give him
Yeah.
credit for showing up too. That's not the easiest thing to do. So Morgan
No.
was celebrating at Toboggan, huge bash there, lots of supporters, of course, but, yeah, I think, a lot of people suggested that was kind of a foregone conclusion. There were other
Yeah.
people running for mayor, but nobody made single digit, results for anybody else other than Khalil Ramal. So
Yeah.
that's that, a cakewalk, we can
A
call
cakewalk for him, for
it.
Morgan, yeah. Morgan did make a speech, after, his win. What is his plan kinda going forward? What are some of the key things that he touched on, and that he's gonna focus on in his next term?
Right. And of course, on election night, with much respect to our new mayor, Josh Morgan, you get a lot of platitudes, right? He's going
Yeah.
to work to make life better for all Londoners, improve the quality of living, working for families, etc. But he had a really detailed platform. I think another expert said to me last night, he was really clear in his campaign. He's running on the idea that he's going to move forward what's already been started by the last council, right? He was deputy for the last 2 years. So he's sort of that status quo guy saying, I'm going to move these plans forward, whether that's, the start, very slow start into climate change action, programs to create more affordable housing. He on transit, he is a big supporter of this mobility master plan, which is a real overarching plan we're expecting from city staff, at some point, I believe in 2023. So he says he's waiting for that before we can really make decisions on where to go with big public transit projects. So,
Mm.
all these sorts of things, not to say he didn't have new ideas. Of course he does. He talked about like rent to own loan program to try and get new people into homes, all sorts of interesting things in his platform. But what it really comes down to is, he's the status quo guy. He's going to continue what was started by this council. So we'll have to
Yeah.
see, really how he hits the ground running and what he's looking to do in those first like 100 days in office. But it's going to be a different kind of job than it may have been for him, just seeing the way the race played out, because he's going to be helming a very divided council. At least that's what I see right now. With some of those upsets that maybe weren't expected last night, you're going to have, I think, some really tight votes over the next term, 8-7, 9-6. I think you're going to see a lot more of that. And maybe what he assumed, or what some may have assumed, would be kind of an easy block for Morgan, the Morgan, Lewis, Lehman, Hilliard, those folks are still around, but some of the others that you may have expected to be joining council might not be in that group, right? Van Holst is gone. And anyway, so, you're going to see some changes there, and it might be a bit of a trickier job, I think, for Josh Morgan to try and
Yeah.
chart that course over the next 4 years with what I expect to be a pretty divided council.
Sure. And there's eight new counselors out of 14, as you said, and there's going to be a lot of growing pains just with those new faces, right? And learning each policies and procedures. Like that takes time,
That
right?
is such a good point, Rachel. I think sometimes that's underestimated, underrated. I find that people who are joining council for the first time, there is a huge learning curve.
Yeah.
It's great to say, here's what I'm running on, here's what I'd love to do, but learning those processes and procedures, learning what you can and can't do, as you say,
Yep.
all of that is can be really difficult and take some time as people kind of get their feet under them. So it'll be interesting to
Sure.
see how those new counselors do, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, let's go through each ward kind of briefly. There's 14 of them, so there's a lot to go through. We'll start with Ward 1, where Hadley McAllister beat Michael Van Holst, who was the incumbent, who may have he drew a lot of scorn over the last term, I guess you could say. But she beat him out.
Yeah,
What's your
Hadley,
analysis? Your
yes,
expert opinion.
Hadley McAllister did. He knocked off Van Holst, and that is an interesting race because there were 9 people vying for that seat in Ward 1. And so I really expected that a number of those candidates would split the vote and reelect Van Holst easily. You're
Mm,
right. He has been a controversial figure, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that, right? He broke councils, was found to have breached council code of conduct in 4 different places because of some of his anti-vaccination or anti-vaccine mandate efforts. So yeah, real polarizing figure.
hmm.
But Hadley, he had the backing of the Labor Council. He clearly had a really good ground game, because that's what you got to do to turn out that vote. And it's really interesting to see him triumph over Van Holst. So that's going to be really interesting and one to watch for sure. He came out several hundred votes ahead at the end of the day. He took about 38% of the vote to Van Holst 28%. So it's not as if it was a squeaker.
Hmm.
Um, Really interesting there, and I think a lot of people will be watching to see how he does for sure. Hadley's, for lack of a better term, like a progressive voice. He ran on progressive ideas, as I say, backing of the Labor Council. So he'll be a very different voice than Van Holst on council. I will
Sure.
say Van Holst was really liked in his ward for doing the constituency work, like showing up for people. So I'm sure, Hadley will try to do the same, or at least, I
Hmm.
think the voters and his constituents will demand it. But it'll be interesting to see how he does.
Yeah.
Ward two.
Oh,
Oh,
Ward
sorry.
2, yeah, no, that's okay. Sean Lewis, he was the incumbent and he ran away with it. He only had one opponent though.
For sure. Not much to say in Ward 2. Sean had it easily. We all knew he would. He just had the one challenger who said he was dissatisfied with Sean's leadership. Mike Unicki, he sort of ran as the anti-establishment guy. He's also an amputee, and he said he wanted to bring the voice of people with disabilities to City Hall. But Lewis is a pretty strong candidate. He really does the constituency work. He talks about his wins. He shares with that. He made his way around the ward. Like, he didn't just phone it in during the campaign either, did a lot of canvassing, door knocking. And he
Hmm.
actually did quite a bit of that during the term as well, which I think people really like seeing their
Sure.
councilor when
Really
they're not just
involved.
running for reelection. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
he had a real easy win there, as expected.
Yeah. Ward 3 is Peter Cuddy, a well-known name from, Cuddy Farms in Strathroy, and he's another new face on council as well.
Absolutely. And I think you're right. I think the name recognition here really helped, both from his family business and also he's a school board trustee with the Thames Valley District School Board right now. So a lot of people will recognize his name. I will say he was he was smooth at the debate, right? You could tell he's used to speaking in front of a crowd. I think he probably sold a strong message at the door. And, I was actually really interested to see how Ward 3 played out. His next strongest, challenger was Bob Wright, who's a retired lawyer, and really made a push for I'm the candidate who actually lives in your ward. There were a couple
Mm,
others who also lived in the ward, but Wright, he had a much better performance than I thought last night. He's a retired lawyer, as I say, and he also talked about how he was, he chaired a mediator board, right? And he was a mediator, and he talked about how there's really nobody that I can't work with. So clearly, his
okay.
message about living in the ward doesn't matter too much because Cuddy doesn't. He does own property in the ward, he says, so he pays property tax there, which I think would sell it to voters. I think that's a
Sure.
perception that people can understand.
Okay.
Cuddy, of course, leans a bit conservative. He sought the nomination both for the Conservative Party federally and the PCs provincially in about the past 5 years, I think. So it'll be
Hmm.
interesting to see how he does. I would expect he would vote with, the Morgan, the Lewis block, but of course we'll have to see what he does. And he certainly got a little bit of experience from school board. That's a natural stepping stone up to council. So it'll
Yeah.
be interesting to see how he does.
Right. There is another trustee who's made it in Ward 7, but we'll get there in a second. Ward 4, Susan Stevenson, she won by a landslide. As we know that Stephen Orser, who is a former counselor, was up against her as well. But she's a new face and she just took it away.
Yeah, another really interesting race, right? I think what you see here is that a number of progressive candidates split the vote. Colleen Murphy, Matt Nicolaitis, and Jared Fisher. And as you say, Stevenson, almost walked away with it. I also heard a couple predictions, people who know politics and thought that Orser might take it, despite doing
Mm,
almost nothing. So that's a really interesting one. I suppose that Susan really sold voters on her message of safety. She sort of trumpeted, like, I'm going to be your common sense approach.
mm-hmm.
Towards the end of the campaign, there was a little bit of interest in the fact that she was a significant donor to the People's Party of Canada. At least she appears on federal donation, lists, and the postal code matches her business address. So that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. She certainly hasn't talked about that publicly, at least as far as I can see. But she's certainly, a more right-leaning candidate, now
Mm-hmm.
counselor, and it'll be interesting to see, what kind of leadership she brings to the ward. The other thing that I think is maybe worth mentioning in Ward 4 is that the outgoing counselor, Jesse Helmer, he did not endorse anyone.
Hmm.
And I kind of wonder if that might have made a difference. Maybe not. This
Yeah,
is also a case of ranked ballots would have been a very different race there, but we don't have ranked ballots anymore, right?
sure. Yeah.
If you could have ranked, a number of progressive candidates, but obviously that's not the case. Jesse came out at the last minute with like a blog post that really urged people not to vote for Stevenson and
Hmm.
said, he could support any of those three candidates that we talked about, Matt, Colleen, or Jared, but it's far from throwing his weight behind one of those candidates. It
Yeah,
doesn't
absolutely.
necessarily mean that that would have sealed the deal, but I do wonder, when you've got a guy like Jesse who won his two terms pretty easily, if that would have lent enough support and some real credibility to one of those other candidates. So we'll have to see how Susan does.
Yeah, absolutely. Ward 5 is Jerry Pribble, another new face. Is that
That's
right?
right. Absolutely. Yeah. And Jerry, I think, despite not having sat on council before, he's really got some name recognition just because of
Yeah.
the roles that he holds in the community. He's a restaurateur, and he also ran for the PCs in the June provincial election. So, yeah, that was an interesting race. You had Connor Pierotti, a teacher, running against him, but this was Jerry's race. And I think most people called that just kind of that presence, that familiarity in the community is hard to beat. And of course, I think his representation kind of makes sense for that ward. That's in the north part of London, Masonville, and Stony Creek, those sorts of areas. So yeah, I think that tracks. And Jerry's a reasonable guy. I'm sure he came across well at the door, put some effort into his campaign, and a name that a lot of people already knew.
Yeah, name recognition there too. Ward 6 was Sam Trosso. Now he beat, and we touched on this before, Miriam Hamu, who was appointed during the last term because the councilor in that ward stepped down. And now she was appointed like 11-3 last term. So the last term councilors really wanted her, but it seems voters this time did not.
Absolutely. This is a really interesting one. So, like Ward 1, an incumbent was turfed, and Sam and Miriam, they were presenting, I think, pretty different visions for the future. Sam is very left. He was talking about things like the need for more protections for tenants. He made a big push about transit. And this is Old North. Ward 6 includes Western University as well. An expert last night told me that in talking to students, Sam's vision seemed to resonate a little bit more. His understanding and calling out of those issues that really affect students, things like the bus driving by you every day, right?
Yeah.
Those sorts of things. Of course, protections for renters, that appeals to a student body as well. So yeah, Sam is a Western law professor. He told me last night he's ready to move on to his next chapter, so he'll be phasing out that work, really going to give his all to city council. I think he will be, we talked a couple of weeks ago, Rachel, about the disruptors. I think he will be a disruptor for
Mm.
sure. So
Hmm.
frankly, I was a little bit surprised. I thought that Hamu would have that race. And it's really interesting. It does kind of track for that ward, right? Old North, a lot of Western folks, both staff and
Sure.
students. So you're gonna lean, fairly progressive in that area. But yeah, Sam is going to be a really interesting counselor to watch. And I think he's going to have a lot to say and a lot that he's trying to change, and maybe even turn on its head. So we'll see what
Yeah.
happens there.
Ward 7 is Corrine Rahman. She's a former trustee, but now on council. Did name recognition help her there, do you think?
I think so, absolutely. Corinne's, very strong candidate. She ran an organized, credible campaign. She got the name recognition from school board. She also jumped into the race really early. Morgan didn't officially endorse her, but I heard from some that they were sort of campaigning together, or signs seemed to go up together, things like that. So she may have
Mm,
had some help that way, but definitely ran a very strong and organized campaign. Good head on her shoulders. So not too surprising to see Corinne's victory in Ward 7.
yeah. Ward 8, Steve Lehman, he's the incumbent. He won by a landslide anyway. Everybody liked him. He's in again.
That's right. Walked away with it. Not too much to say about Ward 8. He had it easy there, and there were a couple of challengers, but yeah, it was clearly going to be Steve's race, and indeed it was.
And it was. And it was the same in Ward 9 with Anna Hopkins, another incumbent, obviously. She won by like 3 times the vote.
Absolutely. So this will be Anna's third term. She's going to be something of, the veteran on council along with Josh Morgan, right?
Sure,
It's
yeah.
going to be really interesting to see that. She had a downtown business owner challenging her in the ward, but he really didn't seem to pick up too much speed. Anna had it easily. It was interesting last night. I said to her, "Did you know you were going to win?" And she said, "Oh, I'm always worried. Like
Oh, really?
I work hard because I'm always worried." She said she loves campaigning, loves canvassing, and so she knocked on a lot of doors.
Mm,
Yeah, I think she'll
it
she'll
worked
have
for
to.
her.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Ward 10, Paul Van Meerbergen again. Was this much of a fight?
I don't think so. Kevin may put up, some good numbers. Paul had it though, easy win for him, and we've seen him do that before, right? Van Meerbergen is, veteran. He's served many,
Hmm.
many terms on council. He was defeated in 2014 by Virginia Ridley, but then knocked her off in the last election.
Hmm.
So, the reality here is he's got lots of name recognition. He's got the experience. He doesn't have to do a whole lot to win that race. Um, unfortunately, or
Exactly.
fortunately, depending on the way you look at it. Yeah.
Right, depending on who you voted for. Ward 11, this one it was interesting to me. Skylar Frank took this one. She got 57% of the vote ish. Point whatever, beating out Jeremy McCall, who we talked about early on. We thought this was going to be a lot closer race. He got about 27%. We thought this would be a lot tighter.
Absolutely. I think this one's really interesting. And again, it really speaks to the ward, right? So, Ward 11, that's Old South, Worley Village area. It does include some other parts as well. But I think there you really see people looking for like a really progressive option. Skylar's a former Urban League president.
Mm,
That's the same. That's the case for their current representative, Stephen Turner. He also endorsed Skylar. Again, she ran a very organized, credible campaign. I think she would have really appealed to people at the door. She's talking about environmental action, transit, a lot of, cycling, these types of priorities that would likely speak to people in that ward. Not to say Jeremy wouldn't. I think he also had a very strong and organized campaign, but just clearly,
mm-hmm.
didn't quite play as well or didn't pick up as many voters as he needed clearly. But I think this is also a little bit the story of low turnout here. And frankly, if
Yeah.
Jeremy had been running in a different ward, he may have taken it. He's a very strong candidate. But yeah, Skylar's going to come out here with the big W, and I don't think that's a big surprise either. She really worked for it, and it fits with the ward.
Yeah. Ward 12 is Elizabeth Pelosa again. She's the incumbent. Again, she won by a landslide. Like it
That's
seems to
right.
be either a landslide or very close, you know?
That's right. That's right. And I don't think anybody predicted that Elizabeth would have much trouble here. She had two challengers, but they didn't have very much name recognition. Not to say they weren't out there trying, but Elizabeth's got a pretty decent record on council, well liked by most of her constituents, and yeah, an easy win for her here.
Okay. Let's do Ward 13 because this one was really close. Speaking of the opposite, David Ferreira beat out John Fife Miller, who was the appointee from last term, right? One of the appointees, but he only won by 34 votes. Ferreira.
Absolutely. It was
34 votes. This is
I
when every
know.
vote, when they say your vote matters, this is where it matters, right?
It really does, 34 votes. So it'll be interesting to see. We may get a recount here. And last night at RBC Place, David Ferreira showed up, and he truly he could not believe that he was winning. Not that I don't think he didn't think he deserved it, not in that way, but he was
Right.
just shocked to see those numbers come through, right? And it's so tight, it's so close. And we were, kind of waiting to see, oh, are there still polls left to report in that area? Oh, no, they're not. Like, David, it's yours, but by 34 votes. So that's a really interesting scenario. I don't know that this was expected by very many people. John Fife Miller, very well known in the community, even after he lost in 2018, he was doing a lot of work in the ward, like
Mm,
building relationships with merchants or in other organizations downtown. So certainly did not expect this. David's really presenting a voice of change. He wants to tackle homelessness. Of course, everybody does, including all the
mm-hmm.
candidates in the downtown. But something about his message must have really resonated with voters. He
Mm-hmm.
did a lot of door knocking, a lot of sitting down with people and really trying to hear their concerns, like conversation circles outside apartment buildings. So he definitely put in the work. David's basically a political unknown, so it's going to be very interesting to see what his representation looks like in that ward. As I say, I think he was overwhelmed last night, but he was heading home to his new baby to celebrate with his own
Oh,
family.
wow. Well, he's
That's
a
right.
busy guy, and now he's going to be a counselor. He's going to be even busier. Okay, last one, and we'll get through this. We have a few minutes left. Ward 14, Steve Hillier, the incumbent, he won, but it was a pretty close race between he and Sarah Lehman.
It sure was. So
Yeah.
Hilliard's just barely hanging on to his seat here. And at different times during the night, I think there was a bit of a question mark above his name. So Sarah Lehman, she ran a really strong campaign as well. I think um, she had some name recognition, right? Like she is known in some circles in this city,
Hmm.
especially nonprofits. She works for the London Abuse Women's Center, but often wears many hats, has multiple jobs, and so people knew her. And I think she again had a really strong ground game. I heard from somebody even yesterday on Monday on election day that she was literally running, sprinting from house to house in like a last minute, get out the vote campaign. So
Wow.
yeah, she really talked to voters. And, on the other hand, Hilliard did not do as much campaigning. He had a surgery, in the middle of the campaign. I don't think he was able physically to get out as much.
Mm.
And Hilliard's also been very, very quiet on council over the past couple of years. He rarely speaks at meetings. I'm not sure, how his constituency work is. You hear mixed reviews sometimes. So yeah, I think this is a really interesting race. She only lost by, a couple of hundred votes. So
Yeah.
very, very interesting scenario there and a very tight race.
Okay. Well, that's what happened last night. I know, Megan, you need to get some sleep because you were up late. It's been a busy. This is like the Super Bowl for journalists, election night, right? So we'll definitely follow all of your stories and updates from City Hall at lfpress.com as you do some new reporting about this new council incoming mid-November. Thank you so much for getting up early to talk to us today.
No problem, Rachel. It's going to be a really fun term to follow and cover, and hopefully we will not see voter turnout this low ever again.
I hope so too. Yeah. Thanks so much.